If you love Rearview Mirror Chronicles podcast and want to help keep us bringing you brilliant episodes, then please share it with a friend or a fellow history fan who you think might enjoy it. Thanks for your support, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, I'm Keith Hockton. I'm an author and a public historian, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the legend that is Amelia Earhart. When you think of aviation icons, both men and women, the first one that comes to mind with me is Amelia Earhart. She smashed aviation records and inspired fellow female pilots. My dad was a pilot, so I actually grew up around aircraft, and my dad worked in some of the most remote places in the world, so I was always around him when he was working on the aircraft that he flew. In 1932, when he was just a boy, his dad, my granddad, took him to Baggington Aerodrome in Coventry, where Amelia Earhart actually made a guest appearance. Can you believe it? Ironically, Dad's first job was there, and he actually became a test pilot there, both just before and after the Second World War. And he said that he was actually inspired by everything that Amelia Earhart did. But who actually was she? She had a distinctive appearance. She was tall and slender, standing about 5 feet 8 inches tall. She had short, wavy blonde hair, often styled in a bob, with very pale blue eyes. People said there was a light in her eyes that kind of captivated you. Earhart's fashion sense was practical yet stylish. She was often seen in trousers, leather jackets, and aviator goggles, reflecting, I guess, her pioneering spirit in aviation. She actually started a craze. She had this crazy kind of confident and adventurous demeanor, which was evident pretty much in every photograph I think that I've ever seen of her and in her public appearances. She was also a pioneering American aviator, and she became famous in 1932 when she was the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic. She was born in Kansas in 1897, and her parents were some of those early Americans who actually crossed through America in a horse and cart, to grab their land rights. They were pioneers of a different kind, and her mother would have definitely ridden side saddle in long skirts. Her father, however, was a more troubled character. He sadly became an alcoholic, so although her mother was a minor heiress, they got through that money bloody quickly, and she grew up with quite a bit of instability in her life. So it was a really kind of filmic upbringing, I would say. Her mother was quite ahead of her times in many ways too. So she would dress Amelia and her younger sister Muriel in bloomers and let them go out and play in their bloomers, which is actually quite shocking, back in the day when girls were meant to be, stand-up white pinafores. So these two would go around catching frogs and hunting, and they built their own go-kart. Amelia loved doing that kind of stuff. When she was 7 years old, her father took her to the St. Louis Fair, and Amelia absolutely loved the look of the roller coaster. Too small to go on it, she actually came back home, borrowed a saw from her dad and some wood, and knocked together her own roller coaster from the roof of her father's tool shed. Absolutely terrifying for a parent. And her mum made her take it down. But it was an incredibly free time for kids. We certainly didn't have the occupational health and safety and kind of helicopter parenting that takes place these days. When she was 9 years old, her father gave her a .22 rifle and told her to go and clear the barn of rats. I mean, can you imagine a parent doing that these days? And pretty soon she was going off to state fairs by herself, and she saw her first aircraft when she was just 10 years old and remembers not being very impressed with it. I think she'd rather go back to a roller coaster. But yes, she was living this incredibly, kind of big thrill-seeking childhood with her sister. As I said, times were freer, things were different. I find it so interesting that she wasn't impressed by her first aeroplane. And I kind of understand why, because at state fairs, planes were just kind of rusty old pieces of wire and wood. And of course, these were pioneering aircraft. They weren't anything to look at, and they were incredibly fragile. Some of them were just made of bamboo and canvas, and very, very thin planks of wood. And they were rust buckets. They were death contraptions. And I think the nickname actually was the Widowmaker for any man that was flying in one. It was a risky business for the early pioneers for sure. If I think back, some of the very early pioneers, Otto Lilienthal, known as the Glider King, he died in a crash in 1896. Samuel Cody, very well known, died in 1913 while he was testing one of the first seaplanes. Percy Plitcher died in 1899 in a very early glider. And Charles Rolls, co-founder of Rolls-Royce, died in 1910 when his biplane crashed during a test flight. So, these were known as terrifying bits of machinery, and she was after the thrill of a wild life in something a little bit more robust, I think, initially. So I understand why aircraft didn't excite her immediately. So before she becomes a pilot, I then wondered, how did she envision her life turning out? Did she actually have that vision? What kind of career did she want to get into? What I found out was that she had an incredibly strong social conscience. She absolutely loved reading. She thought reading was one of the best adventures you could ever have. So she read a lot of George Bernard Shaw. She read Dostoevsky, and people with a lot of, I guess, social content, social standing. And she was actually visiting relatives in Canada during the First World War when she saw a lot of veterans coming back from the front with major disabilities. Some of them were missing limbs. And she thought that this was also something that she could perhaps lend her energies to. So she volunteered for the VAD, the Voluntary Aid Detachment. She never qualified as a nurse, but she was a nurse's helping assistant. Then she decided to take a medical degree. So she went to Columbia University in New York to study medicine. And as a med student, I imagined that she had the most wildest of times. And of course she did. Columbia University has this very famous library with a massive white dome on top. If you can picture St. Paul's Cathedral, obviously it's not the same size as St. Paul's Cathedral, but it's very, very similar shape, just a little bit smaller. And she had this habit of having a great time and then climbing to the top of the library in hard-soled leather shoes. Remember, she wouldn't have had rubber shoes or anything back then. And she climbs the dome and stands on top of the dome. And of course, they find out and she gets, terribly told off for it. But she actually responded to that telling off by persuading her lecturer to climb it with her the next time she went. And he did. So, she was quite the daredevil from a very early age. But the family run out of money. In the end, her mum actually can't afford to keep her at university. So she took to work, sort of social work, really, working in a place called Denison House, which is quite famous, which was based on Toynbee Hall in London, which was a very important part of the settlement movement. And what she's teaching is the settler families of America how to speak English. She's teaching them, I guess, citizenship skills, you'd call it today. And sometimes, driving around the country as well, she would do outreach work, which she was paid a little bit more money for. And on these trips out into the countryside, this was where she would start to see more and more aircraft, crop sprayers and the like. So I then wondered, well, what was it? How was it? How did she first develop an interest in aviation? So look, she took her first flight in 1920. And she'd gone to another of these state fairs with her father, which she just loved doing. And her father actually paid the $10 for her to go on a joyride. $10 was an awful lot of money. So it must have been important for him and for her to do that. And that $10 gave you effectively 10 minutes in the air. And keep in mind, this is a rust bucket. This is an open biplane, open cockpit, a bit like one of those crop sprayers, probably was a crop sprayer. And they're incredibly dangerous planes. There's no parachutes. There's no seatbelts because most of the pilots actually took them out to conserve weight, which used less fuel. And up she went. And she was taken up by a pilot who would later set world speed records. So I imagine it would have been the most thrilling flight ever. And she said as soon as she hit the ground, she knew she had to fly. And so she was immediately swept up once she'd spent that 10 minutes in that cockpit. That was in 1920, and she was determined then to become a pilot. But there were two massive barriers to her doing that. The first one was money. She didn't have any, and it was incredibly expensive to learn how to fly. And what she ended up doing was taking a whole load of jobs, a whole range of jobs to try and earn money. She became a truck driver. She was selling sausages at night. She was a stenographer. She worked in a photographic studio. And she saved money in all sorts of ways. And when she decided she was going to have flying lessons, she even saved money by walking the 4 miles to the airfield on a daily basis. The second problem that she had was when she got there, when she'd saved enough money, it took about $1,000 altogether to get her license. But when she got there, she found that not a single male pilot would take her up because there was sort of I guess you could call them social proprietary issues. I think it was a little bit more than that. I think the men just didn't want the women to be able to fly. So she eventually found a female pilot, a woman with the wonderful name of Netta Snook. She was just 1 year older than Amelia, and they became amazingly good friends. And it was Netta that actually took her up and taught her to fly. So then I wondered, how is it that she then gains fame? What was the first thing that she did that actually made her famous? Well, in 1927, she shot to fame with I'm going to call it a ridiculous flight, but it's not really. There was an American heiress called Amy Guest who wanted to be the first woman to fly across the Atlantic, but she wasn't planning to pilot the aeroplane. She just wanted to be a passenger in the aeroplane. But effectively, her family said, look, this is far too dangerous. Even Amy Guest's children said, you can't do it. It's too dangerous. We're not letting you risk it. And then in the end, Guest sort of succumbed to the pressure. So she then set out a search for a woman to take her place. And she was very specific. It had to be a lady. It had to be someone who was well educated. Amelia Earhart fitted the bill. So Amelia took Amy's place and agreed to be the first woman to fly across the Atlantic. Not as a pilot, but as a simple passenger. And Amelia said she hated it. She said she felt like a sack of potatoes, and all she wanted to do was get up the front with the pilots. But nonetheless, when she arrived on the other side, instant fame. I mean, keep in mind, guys, Charles Lindbergh had only gone across the Atlantic the year before. So this was really seen as something incredibly daring, possibly even suicidal. And of course, she wasn't paid for it, but she quickly gained a lot of commercial opportunities. So she wrote a book about it called 20 Hours and 40 Minutes, which was the actual duration of the flight. And then she endorses products like Lucky Strike cigarettes, even though she didn't smoke. Cosmopolitan magazine made her their aviation correspondent, their first, and she really started to, kind of hit the headlines in a big way. She became known. She became a known name on both sides of the Atlantic. However, the key figure who really helps her is a publisher, George Putnam. He's from an incredibly well-connected family. His family were very good friends with the Roosevelts, and George himself was actually very good friends with the future president, Teddy Roosevelt. Putnam had his fingers in a lot of political pies, and he was also the publisher of Lindbergh's book, and so he was very much involved in the early world of flight and adventure. So he'd actually also been involved in the search for Guest for someone to take part in Guest's, adventure across the Atlantic. And he'd met with Amelia on 2 occasions before she became famous, effectively. George was actually married at that point to Dorothy Binney, whose father had co-invented the Crayola crayon. I mean, most kids these days probably wouldn't know what they were, would they? Would they? I mean, I know what they are, but I don't know what the kids these days would. But anyway, they were a big deal. And she was an absolutely wonderful woman who inherited this incredible fortune from her father. She was also involved in working towards suffrage for women in the United States. This was really kind of hitting its straps in the 1920s. And they had a son together. But nevertheless, within a year of Putnam meeting Amelia, they were in a relationship. They had an awful lot in common. They liked each other immediately. And Putnam, like Amelia, wanted to break frontiers. He'd published a lot of I guess, kind of expedition type books where he actually went on a lot of those expeditions himself. And Amelia had this deep driving passion to set world records and to go out and knock down barriers. And they shared an amazing sense of humor. And I actually think, I don't think they started that way, but I think within a year, they were madly in love with each other. You know, you read reports, if you do any more research on Amelia, that Putnam exploited her, but I don't think he did. It seems to me that she was very keen to promote her own case as well, and I think they just worked very well together. Eventually, Putnam divorced his wife, and he married Amelia the following year in a very private ceremony. They didn't do it for the publicity. They didn't do it for the crowds. They really had an incredibly strong relationship. And it was just the two of them and two witnesses. And I think what's really amazing, and one of the reasons why I've mentioned this, is because the morning of their wedding, Amelia presents Putnam with this amazing letter. It's a fantastic letter. So she kind of wrote her terms and conditions really, for the marriage. And I've actually got a copy of that letter in front of me. So let me read it verbatim to you and you can see what you think. Dear GPP, there are some things that I should write before we are married, things that we have talked over before. Well, most of them. You must know again my reluctance to marry, my feeling that I shatter thereby chances in work, which means most to me. I feel the move just now as foolish as anything I could do. I know there may be compensations, but I have no heart to look ahead. On our life together, I want you to understand that I shall not hold you to any medieval code of faithfulness to me, nor shall I consider myself bound to you similarly. If we can be honest, I think the difficulties which arise may be best avoided should you or I become interested in, or in passing, in anyone else. Please let us not interfere with each other's work or play, nor let the world see our private joys or disagreements. In this connection, I may have to keep some place where I can go to be myself, just now and then, for I cannot guarantee to endure at all times the confinement of even such an attractive cage. I must extract a cruel promise from you, and that is that you will let me go in a year if we fail to find happiness together. I will try to do my best in every way and give you that part of me you know and that you seem to want. A.E. So on the morning of his wedding, George is handed this note by his bride-to-be. And you'd think he'd be upset by it, maybe, but he's not. He's actually really happy with it because he loves Amelia and he knows that freedom is at the core of her and he doesn't want to take any of that away from her. So you know what? No problem. And you know what? They have the most amazingly happy marriage. Now look, just before we move on, I have to say, isn't that letter both brave and forward-thinking? I mean, the letter addresses the complex emotions and expectations about marriage with remarkable honesty and transparency. Amelia's willingness to openly discuss her reluctance, the need for personal space, and a very non-traditional approach to fidelity and freedom shows what a progressive mindset she has. It's an incredibly candid conversation about partnership that many people might shy away from. And I think that makes it a bold and incredibly thoughtful piece. And I guarantee you there are people listening who are thinking, I wish I'd said all that before I was married. So Amelia has a need to set world records. And she has just learned how to fly in 1920, and she's very quick to progress things. She buys the first aircraft in 1921, a little yellow Canea, and she called it the Canary. And she immediately sets a new world record for women's altitude. So she flies to a height of 14,000 feet, which was quite daring and the absolute limit of what that aircraft could do. And if you keep in mind, this aircraft doesn't fly any faster than your average Vespa scooter. It's quite the feat. And keep in mind also, these are the very early days of flight, and these records are being broken all the time, and the press is following it. This is the new thing to follow. So that record was broken the following year, and the year after, she retook it. And, she sees herself, I think, very much part of this pioneering group of women. She dresses in trousers in an aircraft. She cuts her hair really short in that 1920s kind of bob style. And I think these women aviators really kind of see themselves at the forefront of aviation. And they're actually helping by every world record that they set, because that helps develop the aviation technology and what aircraft can possibly do. She also becomes involved in a group called the 99s. And the 99s are a pioneering organization of women pilots that were founded in the late 1920s. This group was actually established by 99 of the 117 licensed women pilots in the United States. Isn't that amazing? And the organization was actually formally created on November the 2nd, 1929, when 26 licensed women pilots met at Curtiss Field. Effectively, the 99s were created to provide mutual support and advancement for women pilots, something unheard of at this particular time. And they played an absolutely crucial role in promoting women in aviation, offering scholarships, education, a network of incredible female pilots. Amazingly, this group continues to exist today, supporting women in all areas of aviation and preserving the history and achievement of these incredible women pilots. Was Amelia a feminist? Of that, there is no doubt. She later said that she hated the term feminist, but she absolutely was, consciously was. And if you look at her action, even as a young girl, she kept little cuttings of newspaper clippings every time she came across the story of a woman excelling in what was then considered to be a man's world, whether it was in academia or sport or business. She was incredibly proud of what these women were out there doing. She would be the girl who would, if boys were jumping on rocks, she would be the girl who went to the bigger rock. She was definitely made of strong stuff, of that kind of stuff. She entered the first competition just for female pilots. It was from LA to Cleveland, a woman's derby. And although she didn't win it, she was absolutely horrified that the press referred to it as the Powder Puff Derby, which is what it became famously known for. And just to backtrack a little bit, it was the very next year that she co-founded the 99s, and she is their first president. And keep in mind, guys, the reason they've got together is to push women to be able to enter the same competitions as men, so that they get a shot at the same kind of, prize money that the men are competing for. And even though the women have less experience in these larger aircraft, which I mentioned before, they're called widowmakers, they're never going to get a chance unless they fight for it, and if they can build up their experience. And this is what the 99s are all about. So she is always pushing for women to have more opportunities, particularly in flight, but pretty much in every other area too. So in 1935, she joins Purdue University, and what she's really fighting for is for women to enter into higher education and to promote women's careers, to promote women's freedom in every aspect. She's really at the core of this. I then wondered whether she'd experienced any, significant hardships or challenges in these earlier flights, because we talked about them being rust buckets, but how dangerous actually were they? And what I found out was that most of these flights were incredibly perilous. And keep in mind, the early flights that she was doing in these pioneering aircraft were before they had parachutes. I mean, if you get into trouble up there, you're not parachuting out. You either have to land the plane or you die. And look, this is the danger that is inherent to that work. It's fundamental to it. In 1930, she became the first woman to fly an autogyro, which is sort of an early type of helicopter, and she also set world records for that. And of course, in 1932, she became the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic. I mean, several women had previously died in that attempt. It was considered virtually suicidal. But with Putnam's support, he was also her main promoter and most ardent fan, and he was excellent at helping her to, raise the funds that she needed for this solo flight. She sets off in 1932, and it's an incredibly dramatic flight. Her altimeter fails over the ocean, and with no land in sight. And then she sees at some stage that there's flames coming out of her exhaust. I mean, this woman had nerves of steel, but she just deals with it. I guess she just have to deal with it, and she does. She later said that flames coming out from her exhaust wasn't that uncommon. Well, thank goodness for that. And it was actually seen as manageable. And then she notes that her plane's actually getting a little bit sluggish. And then she goes into a downward spiral. And she manages to correct that as she's plunging through thick fog. Remember, her altimeter's already failed, so she's got no idea if land is a foot away or a mile below her. I mean, I can't even imagine. And then she saw, I think what probably frightened her the most was that her cabin fuel gauge was leaking. And then she became very concerned that, that leaking fuel into the cabin might ignite because her exhaust flames, the exhaust was on fire. And obviously that would have been catastrophic had it happened. So at that point, she decided that she was going to fly the last part of her journey quite low over the water, because she said she would rather drown than burn to death. I mean, oh my gosh, what a choice. These are incredibly dangerous flights. I should say, of course, that she arrives safely in Northern Ireland. And, she lands in a field. A couple of farmers, who were working in the field come up where she's landed, and they ask her where she's from. And she says, well, I'm from America. And, of course, that absolutely astounded them. And this is what really puts her on the map as an individual for the first time. So at this stage, she's getting telegrams from the great and the good, the president of America. But even at that point, she wasn't sure that her future would be in aviation. And I think that's also kind of wonderful. She was involved in the social scene, and I think she loved that social scene, maybe more than she loved flying. From Dublin, she goes on a small hop over to London, and from there, she drives to Coventry, which is where my dad saw her. You remember I mentioned that at the beginning of the podcast. And while she was there, she was quite fettered. She had a dinner where she sat between Nancy Astor and Churchill, but she still took time out to go and see Toynbee House, which was the inspiration for Denison House, where she had worked in the US. So I think she was still thinking that maybe after her flying career was over, she might have a second career in social work. So I don't think she was really that sure about where her future was or what her future was holding. So by 1937, a lot of the world records had already been set, but one that was left was to fly to circumnavigate around the entire world. Now, this is something that no woman had ever done before, and Amelia Earhart decided that she wanted to do this and that it would be her last great world record before she turned 40. She was just 39 years old. And she also decided that she would be the first person to fly around the world, circumnavigating around the equator, which is actually the fattest part of the world. Everybody thinks the world's completely round. It's this perfect circle, but it's not. Our planet, this amazing planet that we live on, is actually a spheroid. So it's nearly flat at both the poles, and then it's round at the sides. And she wanted to fly over the flat, fat bit, the longest distance. So she was giving herself an extra challenge there, but no one had ever done it before. So again, they set everything into place. George Putnam is supporting her. There's heaps of PR. She's doing lecture tours to raise money, all that sort of thing. The press are following her daily. And she decides to invest in a Lockheed Electra. This one she decides not to name. And she does it for a very specific purpose. She doesn't want any other name in the papers alongside her own. Quite savvy when you think about it to the PR side of things. And she sets off first going to Hawaii. She had a couple of navigators because they were going so far over the oceans, she actually needed a pilot and an additional navigator. And she starts off with two, with a guy called Harry Manning and Fred Noonan. And these guys are both naval aviators. But Noonan had gone on to be really, I guess he's the world's leading celestial navigator. He also used dead reckoning, which is sort of, mass calculating, wind speeds, your height, your aircraft speed, and so on. So he's actually the more valuable of the two. And he's constantly, making placements so that Amelia knows exactly where she is, no matter day or night. So they fly the first leg to Hawaii, where Manning actually makes a very heavy landing. And at this point, whether she decided or whether he decided, he leaves the team. From there on in, it would just be Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan as her navigator. And they'd also at this stage got rid of their marine frequency radio because Manning is the guy that operated that. He was the real expert with Morse code and using, that kind of communication. So it didn't actually make sense to have the extra weight when he left. So they got rid of it. And then they set off on the next leg. But we don't actually know entirely what happened. We don't know if it was pilot error or a technical fault with the aircraft or some combination of the two. The aircraft went into a ground loop while they're actually on the runway, which means it spun around on the ground very, very fast. And of course, then the wheels gave way and it crushed quite a lot of its undercarriage. And it was clear that they couldn't continue. They had to take the Lockheed back to the US. They freighted it back to America. That had to be mended. Costs were just crazy. I think it cost them something like $13,000. And at this stage, she also had the opportunity to stop. And the reason why I raised that as a thought is because sometimes things happen for a reason. On earlier flights, her altimeter had failed. There were, fire bolts coming out of the exhaust. Now she's crushed the undercarriage. And I sometimes think maybe there's just, something in the universe is telling you that you shouldn't be doing this kind of flight. Just raising it as an issue, guys. But she didn't want to stop because what she was terrified of was being remembered as the woman who crashed in Hawaii rather than the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic. She was very proud of her achievements, and rightly so. So they managed to raise more funds. They went back, still the very same year, and they set off again. And this time she had the most perfect takeoff. And then they have this extraordinary journey all the way through the summer of 1937. And of course, now they've changed direction. They had to because they've missed their opportunity and they're now going west to east now around the world. And effectively, they had to do that because the monsoon season had come into their flight path. So they're now going the other way around the world. So that gives them a bit of a chance to do some sightseeing and have some downtime. And they actually, on every single stop, from Oakland to Burbank, from Burbank to Tucson, Tucson to, New Orleans, New Orleans to Miami, they do a little bit of sightseeing and the crowds come to love them. And look, yes, there are a few little technical hitches that the engineers and they're sorting out, but they're sorting them out. And that's the main thing. From Miami, they fly to San Juan in Puerto Rico and from there to Caprito in Venezuela. Again, radio issues are dogging them, but they're able to sort it out. From Venezuela, they fly to Paramaribo in Suriname, and from there to Fortaleza in Brazil. And it's here that they hit severe turbulence. And get this, the plane flips and then dives over 400 feet. And they manage to regain control just above the tree canopy. From Natal in Brazil, they fly out over the Atlantic for the first time, en route to Senegal in Africa. I mean, I have such admiration for how brave these two people are. And I think one of the wondrous things about this particular trip, and, this is quite funny. Amelia, when she was a child, she had always been a voracious reader, and she'd read all these incredible stories of adventure into Africa that had been written, kind of circa 1910. You can only imagine what it was like for her flying across the Atlantic to Africa. It's got to be real vindication that she was suddenly the adventurer, and she's adventuring. And look, I guess she was a little bit concerned that they may come down in Africa, in uncharted territory, in darkest Africa. And I think she thought it was quite primitive. So she actually packed 2 machetes and 2 pith helmets just in case they did. Because in her mind, that was all that was needed for her to survive. Anywhere in Africa, that's all you needed. A pith helmet and a machete. But on the bright side, they had no glitches in Africa whatsoever. And she actually reports seeing large herds of elephants, literally elephants in their thousands, and great swarms of flamingos. Her last stop there after landing and refueling in Chad in the Sudan was Eritrea. And it was here that they actually bade farewell to Africa and said hello to Asia. So their first stop is northwest India, what we would now call Pakistan, and they land just as the sun is setting. She actually made a note of it. From there, they flew across the top of India to Calcutta, and then down to Rangoon, and then down further to Bangkok. The King of Siam meets them at the airport and has dinner with them at the palace. I mean, these must have been absolutely seminal moments on the trip. I mean, what incredible memories. From Bangkok, they go to Singapore, and then to Bandung, and then Surabaya, and then they're across to Timor, and then finally arriving in Darwin in Australia on June the 28th, 1937. They'd both lost a lot of weight, and both of them were completely exhausted. But the end of this epic journey was in sight. They can taste it. They can feel it. And I can only imagine the excitement and how this would have spurred them on for this final leg. A day after arriving in Darwin, they leave for Papua New Guinea, landing in Lae, where the entire district turns out to see this amazing couple in their incredible flying machine. That was on July the 2nd, 1937. And although they hadn't had any further radio issues, a radio operator there decides to service their radio just to be on the safe side. As I mentioned, by this stage, they are both utterly exhausted. They'd undergone hardship. They had maintained this amazing relationship. They're in this very tiny cockpit, and it's really just only big enough for her to stretch out her limbs. And, Noonan is actually sitting further back down the aircraft because there's no room for him up front. And at this stage, he's actually put a big bit of glass into the ceiling so that if they're flying at night, he can actually navigate by the stars. And the only way they can communicate, because it's so noisy in the cabin, is by a fishing rod, which they cut down and put little notes on the end of and pass back and forth between each other. But they've done this really epic journey, and they virtually finished. They've only got one big leg left, which is from New Guinea back to Hawaii. But they can't do the whole thing in one go because they can't carry enough fuel. So they're looking at various ways of refueling in the air. And that's incredibly daring and very dangerous. It's incredibly daring and very dangerous now, but even more so back then. So they decide against that. In the end, they decided that they would stop at a tiny pinprick of an island in the Pacific called Howland Island. It's basically a coral atoll. As I said, it's a pinprick on the map in the middle of the Pacific. It's about 2.5 miles long by probably half a mile wide. It's nothing. It's absolutely tiny. And it would need absolute real precision navigating to reach it. But everybody has great faith in Fred Noonan. I mean, this is the one guy in the world that you can put him in a cave, and if he sees a star, he'll work out where he is and get out. And so they're all set. And off they go to Howland Island, the last stop to Hawaii, where she can be crowned the undisputed queen of the skies before she turns 40. So they take off and everything's fine. Everything actually seems to be going very well. They had radio communications in place. There are a number of Navy or coastal cutter ships below, almost kind of following their route to provide radio connection for her during this journey. And the one ship that's very near Howland Island is called the Itasca. But radio communication with that particular ship was difficult. The signal was actually quite weak, perhaps because there's a lot of commercial traffic in the area, on this one particular day. But quite a few of the signals just don't get through. And eventually, after they'd radioed several times, they managed to connect with the Itasca But keep in mind, guys, they had certain schedules that they had to meet during this flight. There were certain time schedules that they had to meet if they're to make it, not only just in time, but with the fuel that they actually have. So the radio messages aren't getting fully through to the Itasca. Things aren't going entirely to plan. But what does become obvious is that they're not receiving the Itasca's broadcasts. I think the Itasca probably didn't realize that they had ditched the marine frequency radio. So the Itasca is probably sending Morse code and they're not getting it. So that's one problem. Because at stages, the Itasca is sending out multiple messages on multiple frequencies and they're not receiving anything back in return. And this is actually vital because this communication is what helps them with their navigation. With dead reckoning navigation. So Noonan would have been at a real disadvantage at this stage. And then as they're supposed to be approaching the Itasca and Howland Island, Amelia's voice finally comes through, but it's breaking up. But she eventually comes through saying that she's approaching. They think that they're approaching, but they begin to get quite concerned because they're not seeing anything at all. And what the Itasca then decides to do, which is very smart, is set up this big column of smoke because they're in the middle of nowhere. And the Itasca start burning oil in their engine room to create this amazing smoke pillar. And they send up this massive column of smoke that they say should be able to be seen for at least 10 miles. And the other good news is that the Itasca reports that it's a completely clear day. So they reckon this column of smoke, it should have easily been seen by Amelia and Noonan. It's another beacon for them to cling on to. But they never arrive. And one of Amelia's last messages says that they're running low on fuel. And then she says that we're on the line and we're flying north and south trying to find you. And that is the last message that comes through. So what are the theories on what happened to her? Well, there are many theories. As always, they spring up in a vacuum of knowledge. So in the immediate hours afterwards, there were lots of reports of radio signals from her, from amateur people who were actually listening in. They'd probably heard the Itasca trying to contact her. Some of them were possibly hoaxes looking for their 15 minutes of fame. There was so much PR around it. Lots of radio enthusiasts knew where to tune into and what to say. So it's quite possible that most of these were hoaxes. But the Itasca did send out messages, and they immediately went to Howland Island to try and find her, but nothing was ever found. Roosevelt and Eleanor were both friends of Amelia. So Roosevelt actually launches this massive search and rescue mission. 4 ships are actually sent out and the president's actually on one of them, and it took the fastest ship 11 days to get within the area. There were over 4,000 men involved in this search, and it cost upwards of $4 million. In the end, it turns out to be a political nightmare to continue, and the whole search was called off after 2 weeks. So then you have a whole series of more theories of what happened to her. And many of them are just absolutely ridiculous. There's a theory that because she was friends with the president, that perhaps she was an American spy. And, she'd agreed to fly her plane to a different atoll and just lie low, therefore giving the American government the authority, to do a search of these Pacific islands. And this particularly took hold just after 1941, in December of 1941, when we have, the Japanese attacking Pearl Harbor, which was the participator for, America actually joining the Allies in the Second World War. So there's this rumor, this feeling that, this rising hatred against the Japanese, and that it may have been a political thing, that Amelia Earhart was involved in this. But of course, there's absolutely no evidence of that. And I think the most telling thing is that Amelia never, ever resurfaced. Amelia was this incredibly passionate woman. She loved her mother, she loved her sister, she loved her husband, and she loved her career. And she wouldn't have just disappeared. What do I think? Sometimes the obvious, most simple answers are the answer. All the way through the adventure, there were issues with the radio. I talked about signs and whether they should have continued. And to be honest with you guys, I think had it been me, I wouldn't have continued. There were too many signs telling me that this wasn't the right mission to be on. What we do know is that they were exhausted. I mean, these guys had literally been in a tiny cockpit on their last leg of the journey many, many hours after leaving Leh. And the distance to Howard Island, it's a long way. It's 2,555 or 56 miles. This leg of the journey was one of the longest and the most challenging due to the vast expanse of open ocean that they had to travel across. And the smallest target that they had to hit was that of Howland Island. It seems an almost impossible task. And the difficulty in navigating this stretch, combined with, potential weather issues and radio communication problems, contributed, and I think still contributes to the mystery of Amelia Earhart's disappearance. Amelia had actually sent messages back to George Putnam as well, her husband, talking about radio problems and personnel issues. Well, there were only two of them, so the issue had to be with Fred Noonan. And who knows what that was about, but if she's talking about personnel issues, then that could have caused communication issues between her and Fred in the cockpit as well. She'd actually reported on the radio that they were running low on gas. They were still searching for the island. So it seems almost certain to me that the aircraft just ditched into the sea. Now, look, they did have a life raft and paddles and inflatable jackets, but these are all stored at the back of the plane. I mean, even the aircraft just smashing into the sea could have destroyed the entire aircraft at that point, and they could have just died on impact. If they had survived that, would they then have been able to get the life jackets, to get the raft up and running? Maybe. We also know that a storm came in later that day where there were reported 10 to 15 foot waves, especially across that part of the region. We also know that that particular part of the Pacific, it's completely shark infested. So, I mean, there are so many threats to life if you come down in a very small plane in that area. But I think the plane pitching into the sea, I think that's almost certainly how they died. Her story has completely captured people's imaginations for so long. There's so much in there. She's really emblematic of this American pioneering spirit. She's a good American woman, and she's also a woman, and that's the most important point. She's this fantastic beacon for what women can achieve, that women are quite as able as men and should be as free as men to take on the same challenges. And she's a world record setter. She was the first woman to pilot across the Atlantic. I mean, these are massive achievements. She was a huge celebrity, and it was this very glamorous age of flight. Amelia Earhart even had her own fashion line. She was this massively recognizable face. And above all, of course, you've got this incredible mystery where here we are, some 90 years later, still talking about her. Look, we don't know what exactly happened to her. I don't think we'll ever find out. And at this stage, I don't think we really need to know. What we really need to know is who Amelia Earhart was. And in the end, she was this incredible woman, aged 39, who set out to achieve a world record. I think her legacy, I think her greatest success was demonstrating that women are as able as men. Even when she's seen as socially unacceptable, for them to take on the challenges and to absolutely succeed, she does it. So in setting that example that women should be as free as men, I think it says it all. Her greatest failing? Well, she didn't succeed in becoming the first woman to circumnavigate the Earth in the air. I mean, that record actually wasn't set for another 30 years. And I must say that we should know more about the name of that woman, who was a woman by the name of Jessie Mock, who set that record. But Amelia, look, she didn't achieve that, but she did achieve the fame, the celebrity. She achieved so much in terms of the way that she actually pushed women in pioneering and pushed the machines to support ever more and tests of endurance and ability. And she did say that one of her greatest fears was to grow old slowly. Again, I talk about her legacy today. She has a lot of legacies. I mean, there are hundreds of monuments to her across America and overseas, where she first landed or departed in Hawaii and in Northern Ireland. And there are living legacies as well, in that the 99s had the Amelia Earhart Award to encourage female pilots. And there's a lot of academic institutes that now have Amelia Earhart bursaries and awards for women in higher education and careers. That is something pretty bloody special. But I think beyond that, her greatest legacy is her example and the inspiration she's provided to generations of both men and women. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.